most prominent of the reformers in connection with what we think of as the Reformed tradition as opposed to the Lutheran tradition is, of course, John Calvin. And John Calvin is developing this tradition from its emergence in Switzerland. So Lutheranism is a reform movement that emerges in what is today northern Germany. The Reformed tradition emerges in Switzerland and spreads also in France. And so these reform movements are popping up in different places. And the first generation of these, Luther and Zwingli, are both people who are born in the late 1480s. Now, Calvin is a generation later. He's born in 1509, and he is very much a part of French church life in this period of time. His father believed that he would earn more money as a lawyer than as a cleric, and so he does that. He then moves on later to another university, and it's there that he becomes acquainted with the streams of humanism, the ancient understandings of law from ancient Greece and Rome. He studies Greek, and which becomes a necessity for him as well in his readings of the New Testament. So at this point he's at the University of Bourges, and we don't know a whole lot about it, but at some point during this period of time he has a kind of conversion experience. Not much is known about the circumstances. Unlike Luther, who is quite in touch with his own emotional life, Calvin doesn't tell us a lot about these kinds of things. He has in the preface of his commentary on the Psalms these words. He says, "God by a sudden conversion subdued my mind to a teachable frame, which was much more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life." That's what we know about Calvin's conversions. And of course, scholars have argued exactly what that meant. But what is clear is that this is a break for Calvin from his Roman Catholicism. So in 1532, he receives his license in law, and he also publishes his first book, which is a commentary on an ancient Latin text, Seneca's On Clemency. And it's suspected that he wrote this in order to try and convince the king, Francis I, to be more lenient toward Protestants. He returns to Paris, and during this time there's a whole lot of tensions that are being caused by Protestantism or at least reform movements within the church in France that are bubbling up. These are coming up by the humanists who have this vision of a much more ethical church than the one that they see going around them. And there's a conflict within the faculty at the University of Paris between sort of these younger folks who want this reform and older, more conservative faculty members. One of the people on the reforming side is a guy by the name of Nicholas Kopp, who was the rector of the university, which is a very high position. And he devotes his inaugural address to advocating for reform. Now, it's suspected, too, that Calvin had a hand in writing this address. There was a very strong reaction. The address was denounced as heretical, and Nicholas Kopp has to flee the country. He flees to Basel in Switzerland, which is at this place a center for Reformation. Calvin is forced into hiding back in his hometown of Noyon, and then moves on to Orleans. And it's at this position that he finally resigns all of his church benefices, all of the incomes he's getting from different Catholic Church sources to support himself in his studies. He is finally forced to flee France itself after this affair of the placards, which is this affair of the posters. A bunch of unknown reformers post posters around in various cities attacking the Catholic Mass, and there's a kind of mob backlash against this and against all Protestants. And so Calvin decides he's going to join Kopp in Basel and flee to Switzerland. It's during this time that Calvin publishes his most important work, his Institutes of the Christian Religion. And this work is dedicated to the King of France, and it's a defense of Protestant doctrine, of the Protestant faith, a statement, a clear statement of Protestant positions on certain matters of doctrine that are in dispute by the Reformers. And this initial book, this is the first expression of Calvin's own theology. It's actually very short. It only had 6 brief sections. It could fit actually in the large pockets that people wore at that time. So it could be easily, transported and the ideas could be spread. For a while, he returns to France, but there is an edict which says all heretics must reconcile with the church or be expelled, and Calvin decides he has no future in France, and so he sets off for the city of Strasbourg on the border between Germany and France, and it was a city at that time that was very open to Reformation. That's where he wants to go, but there's a war, and he can't go straight there, and he has to go around the lines of fighting to get to Strasbourg. And so he goes around, and on the way, he stops in Geneva. And it's there that he meets a fellow French reformer in that city who had immigrated from France to Geneva, was trying to work on reform, named Farel, William Farel. And Calvin tells him, look, I'm not sticking around here. I'm on my way to Strasbourg. I want to be there. And Farel says, look, if you leave, may God condemn the repose and calm you seek for study. If you neglect such a great need and withdraw, and you refuse to help at this time. And Calvin wrote that these words broke him. He heard this as a call from God. And his own understanding of the working of God, which was, that one, in some sense, was selected for certain purposes. This meant that this was where he was supposed to be. And so he began work in Geneva to try and reform. And that was difficult work for him. There was conflict, partly over his own ethnicity, because he was French, and Geneva, which was part of the Swiss Union, which was had independence. So the Genevan Swiss did not think of themselves as French, and found this a kind of foreign imposition into their structure. While he's trying to impose discipline on the church, folks who were Genevans, especially elites and Genevans, didn't want to be disciplined. They didn't want to have their lives conformed to the character of Christ in order to come to communion. They wanted things to go just as they were. They didn't want to have the Pope, but they didn't want anybody else holding them to any kind of discipline either. That came to a head. That was a very conflictual relationship. Eventually, both Farel and Calvin are thrown out of Geneva. Calvin gets to go to Strasbourg, and it's there that he has his most productive time, rewriting the institutes, helping to produce a hymnal, beginning to do his commentaries, which become very much a part of his legacy. Gets married to a woman, Idelette de Boer, and so has family life with her children from a previous marriage. She was a widow, and has the kind of life he had actually always hoped to have. And then things without Calvin and Farel in Geneva start to go south for the Genevan. So while Calvin was gone in Strasbourg, Roman Catholic Cardinal Sadoleto had tried to convince the Genevans to come back to Rome, and the city council realized they needed somebody to write a letter in refutation so that the people wouldn't want to go back to Rome. And they asked someone else first, but eventually asked Calvin. He writes his letter to Sadoleto, and the council realizes they need Calvin, so they invite him back, and he returns. And when Calvin returns, he is able to pass through the council major reforms to the church, which make church membership necessary to be a Genevan citizen, essentially, and also impose discipline on those who are going to consider themselves members of the church. You can't just call yourself a Christian and live however you want. There are expectations involved in being a Christian. Again, this is not received necessarily by a number of Genevan elites who don't like any restrictions on them, and he faces constant opposition, constant threats, people writing threats and leaving them on his pulpit anonymously, all kinds of harassment. What finally breaks this pattern of frustration and harassment over discipline within the church is the arrival of a anti-Trinitarian heretic named Servetus. He is from Spain. He had actually been imprisoned in Austria and was condemned as a heretic to death there, but he manages to escape, and he decides to make his way to Geneva, even though he had already heard from Calvin that Calvin would not guarantee his safety, that Calvin considered him a heretic and he should not come, basically. Servetus was kind of crazy, it has to be said. He honestly seems to have believed that he could convince Calvin of his heretical views. He comes to Geneva, he is recognized, he is arrested, and the defense of Servetus is one of the families who is opposing Calvin. And the problem with this for that side was that they were now defending a known heretic who had been condemned by all of the Roman Catholic Church, but also all Protestants as well. So the Genevans sent out to the other Swiss churches to get their opinions on this Servetus trial, and it all came back that he was guilty and he should be condemned. And so the day after all of those came back, Servetus was condemned and he was sentenced to be burned. The same sentence he had been given in Vienna. So they weren't going to, the Protestants weren't going to show that they were, soft on heresy any more than the Catholics. Calvin himself asked for a much more humane execution than what was actually given. After Servetus's death, there continued to be struggles with the French refugees who were coming into Geneva to find a safe place where they could worship God in the way that they wanted to in a reformed way, and the Genevans who wanted a much more lax church life. Geneva becomes a magnet at this point for people who are looking to find a place where they can live in a truly Christian community. Geneva is known at this day as a woman's paradise because it is one of the few places in Europe where, for example, husbands are not allowed to beat their wives. There are all sorts of rules in place that guard against abuses of power by people who claim to be Christians. And so people are coming in to see what it's like to live in a Christian society. The population of Geneva explodes. And this is especially true, people who are fleeing from England and Scotland from when Mary is on the throne in England and tries to return England to Roman Catholicism. A number of Puritans come to Geneva and they learn what it's like to live in a place that tries to actually live according to the discipline of a churched life. Calvin starts a school, and that school produces preachers who then go out and are missionaries, starting hundreds and hundreds of Protestant churches throughout, especially the south of France. And this becomes a center not only for spreading this reformed vision of church life, but also for missionizing other parts of Europe. And this is all despite the fact that within places like the Holy Roman Empire, Reformed Christianity is illegal, and yet it spreads.